All right,
You're
this is
recording now.
this is the code organization meeting for July 23rd, 2020. We have a fairly light agenda, so hopefully we will have plenty of time for discussion. A couple of things off the top. There was a link around the discussion for picking a name for the proposed Library Go package. This is a place for basically helper methods that operate on API types that need to be used by the API server and the controller manager and the scheduler and sort of multiple components so they don't slot neatly under one component. So there was some discussion around the name. There's a link to a suggestion. Most of the people who were participating in that discussion are not in this meeting, so I think continuing the discussion in that thread in that issue is probably fine. Personally, I think API helpers or component helpers is fine. So yeah. Second item was around moving kubelet APIs to an externally available location. And so it looks like these are the device manager or the CRI APIs. Or no, these are the config APIs. Is that right?
Yeah. They still need review from SIG node, so I just it was just an FYI in case you wanted to look at it here.
Okay. Did we not move? I thought we already moved the device plugin APIs to a publicly available location. We did. So device plugin is already there. Plugin registration is also already public. I'm not quite sure which APIs this is moving. Programmatically validate which labels kubelet will accept. Oh.
So the PR doesn't actually move everything in the APIs directory, it just moves to root files in the APIs directory. No idea why, though.
Okay. All right. I will queue those up to look at. All right, Walter, you want to?
Sure. So today, I don't know if it's all at this point with the state of things being moved around, but most of the features are Kubernetes private APIs. And there are a few that the CCM, and I imagine others later, will need to do their jobs for them to be public. I'd prefer the CCM only be compiling against public APIs, so things under staging. So this brings a couple of interesting problems. One, it means the features are now being stored in multiple places just because of build hierarchy. So it'd be good for us to have some opinions about where those can and can't live, how we initialize them, how we make sure the initialization is consistent, and it would also be nice, at least in my perspective, to try and make sure that if you're using a feature, that it is initialized, and that if it isn't initialized, that it's a compile time error, not a runtime error. I'm happy to chat about any of that. That's sort of my broad perspective on this. And then I know, like David David Eads on API machinery also would, if we're not careful about it, he has concerns that we're going to end up with. He doesn't like inits to begin with, and he's a little concerned we're going to end up smearing init in multiple packages each separately setting up a subset of the features.
Yeah. All right. So I'm trying to take each of the things you
Brought up.
So we're defining features in multiple places. So we already did this for API server features and cube features. And the question is, like, how do we want to approach this as we start like partitioning more features out? Like, what is the primary owner for a given feature? Should the feature definition live in that component's exported repo? And how do we stitch? How do we symbol a into the feature gate used in a given process? Is that sort of the...
Yeah.
Okay. Multiple places. And then handling registration errors, runtime error. So a long time ago, if you asked if something was enabled and it wasn't registered, enabled would just return false. So you wouldn't even know that it hadn't been registered correctly.
Agreed. Now, David and I researched this last week, and we're fairly convinced it will throw an error if you ask for something that isn't enabled.
It does. That isn't registered. It does now. So runtime error, panic.
So at this point, we're guaranteed a runtime error, but it'd be nice if it were compile time.
Yeah. And so the only way for that to happen is for us to auto-register on init. Is that correct?
I'm not convinced it is, actually. I mean, so if there, well, maybe, but if we somehow can hook the declaration of the constants with a something that puts itself in or is somehow called from the init, then the fact that you're pulling in one means you get the other. But yeah, that may mean you're dealing with the init.
Yeah. And so I think it requires an init, and I think it requires a shared global. Like if we're going to register via init, then we have to be registering to a consistent place.
We do that today, right? We have one map, which is the feature map, and that is a global.
Yeah, there's multiple. So, like just recently, when we removed the internal depths in the service controller, a bunch of tests broke because they were depending on the global feature gate. And then when we cut that tile, the test broke. So like if we didn't have those tests, we probably would have shipped a version of Service Controller with the Cloud Controller Manager that never checked the flag, like that never imported the flag, and then that would have just been completely broken. So I think there's a private one and the API server one, right? And so for testability, it'd be great if there was just like one shared global one and all the components just imported that, and we can just assume that all the global feature gates are available across the board.
Trying to find component-based feature gate.
So Andrew, I don't know what anyone else's experience was, but that was mostly static for me.
Yeah.
So I would love to know what you said, but I really couldn't understand it.
So I see two places where we are setting up feature gates. So we set them up.
I think KK package features, and then there's one in API server.
Right. I'm trying to see how we get the one that we. Oh, it looks like. Oh man, it looks like we already register into a shared global. Look at that.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. We're already registering into a shared global, so that's. I'm not saying it's good, but I'm saying that is already how it works.
Global feature. So the question is, so if we're going to have other components under staging referencing a shared global, clearly it should not be an API server.
Yes, yeah, I think we're all in agreement on that.
Okay. And what was David's suggestion instead of init? Have a register method, sort of like the add to scheme thing that we do with API types?
Yes. That was essentially it. I think he still ends up having one in init, and in fact, I don't think you can get away from having two once we want to go have both a public and a private. But I could be wrong. Maybe I'm not understanding, but. But yes, his suggestion was definitely that there be a register method so that you could actually have the features in the appropriate places, and they would register in the appropriate packages, and then they would register with some very low-level library that actually did the feature work.
So if we want the feature names to be at the API level, which is what he's proposing,
Yep.
then was he also suggesting moving the feature gate mechanism to API machinery instead of it being in component base?
I think, yes, I believe so.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I should share my screen. It's not that interesting to just watch me frown at my monitor. Yeah. So when I talked through this with David, having the feature definitions in API made sense to me. They're basically just constants mapped to current state, and that is strongly tied to a particular version. If we want them to auto-register on import, then
I mean, to be clear, it's not that's a nice to have. I am generally in favor of anything that allows for compile time versus runtime errors, especially since every cloud provider is going to be creating and maintaining their own copy of the CCM. and maybe adding their own controllers with their own features. And so I would like this to be as bulletproof as possible.
I guess one question I have is, if we auto register features on import in init, what happens if a cloud provider wants to change a default value for a feature in their build? Does that break or does it work? Like, because I can imagine like the defaults for X, Y, and Z, especially for some of these things, like they default false because they require setup and other things. But then a particular cloud controller or cloud would want to say, we want to default, like we are now doing that setup, we want to default it on in this version. Can they do that?
Well, I think one way or the other, they're going to be able to, but it's an interesting question because I believe if you actually dig through the code today, if you end up having the fields re-register between public and private, between the API server and the KK. And when the KK re-registers the value, if it finds the value has changed, I believe it actually blows up.
That's what I sort of remembered.
I believe it does. That's certainly my interpretation of the code. And I mean, beyond that, I would suggest that that's probably reasonable in that if someone wants to change the feature value, it could probably be done through the CLI or the config, not through code.
I mean, I guess if you don't change it via registration, but you change it like using the same path that the command line flag would change it. So like register everything and then like set whatever features you want to be, and then like parse the flags. I don't know. Like, because what's tricky is like build X of a given cloud's controller manager is not necessarily like Kubernetes 118. Like it might be depending on the Kubernetes 118 API library, but like they might have their own versioning release progression. So
I mean, that's true, but I will point out, like, if you look at them doing it with a different library, like Client Go, if you're using the wrong version of Client Go to talk to your master, sooner or later that's going to create problems. So I don't think this is new.
yeah. And then the other question I had is, do we want to prevent Client Go from referencing or using features? I think we do, because Client Go doesn't have a mechanism for toggling those features. Like today, the features are defined at a much higher level, and so like it's just sort of crazy making to be like, how does my client behave? It's like, well, it depends. It depends. Like, did you set a feature? It's like, what feature? I don't have any control over the features.
So to play devil's advocate, and I think you're right, but I'm still going to play devil's advocate. The new priority and fairness, like if I feature gate priority and fairness, I could see maybe wanting to turn off or somehow control the client's rate limiting behavior in conjunction with how priority and fairness is set up. And I'm not even sure how that would work, but but I mean, it does make sense, right? If I've got priority and fairness, I probably don't want rate limiting.
Yeah, I think the two bits there are we don't have a good way to control it. Like we don't have a CLI or a config. I feel like if we expose feature gates in kubeconfig, the mobs will come for us with pitchforks, and they probably should.
They probably should. Like I said, I don't actually agree with what I'm saying, but I felt someone needed to play devil's advocate.
Yeah. Okay. If we move it there, I think at least to start, we should set up import guards to prevent client Go from referencing that package, so that we don't do it accidentally. If we come up with a good reason why we want to do this and a good story around it, then we can think about it.
Yeah, I'll agree with that.
Okay. All right. The one downside I can see for init blocks. So if all features live in Kids.io API and all register on init, then the utilities we have that bind those to like a command line flag will always list all features in that release, even if you're using this for like something which only pays attention to 3 of the features.
So I think that was, I mean, so the thought had been that while we, so we should, I think, let me go back. I think when David was looking at breaking this out, I mean, he was looking at defining them at the bottommost level. So you have sort of the visibility of what all possible feature flags are, but then actually setting up the initialization at appropriate points. So as an example, if we've moved service controller into the cloud provider packet, or not cloud provider, excuse me, into the controller manager package, when you pull in controller manager, that will then set up the 2 flags that the service controller needs. So I mean, if you're not using the service controller, then you're getting that even though those flags and they're being registered even though you don't want them. But only when you pulled in service controller would you get those 2. I believe that's how he was trying to set it up.
I see. So, okay. So it's on a init, but it's on a init of a particular component, which means that you don't get the behavior you want, where like I've written a random program and I'm referencing the Kids.io API feature definition, but I didn't import this thing over here which registered it.
Yeah, like I said, mine is, I think, more of a nice to have. I just worry that it's really easy to write one of these things and fail to init it correctly unless you're using init blocks. Like you have to know I'm pulling in these 4 packages, and so I have to call each of their 4 register feature methods to get the features I need. And if I don't, it'll become a runtime error.
Yeah. Is there a pattern we want to use for this? Like if you call dot enabled and you pass in a feature name, like at the top of that file there needs to be an init block that says I use this feature name, so that if anything by any path like imports this file, I can be sure that this feature is registered.
I mean, that's that works, but that's the thing that I think David doesn't like, right? That's his objection to smearing the init blocks across multiple repos.
I mean, the alternative is smearing panics across multiple repos. Because if it's runtime, like a lot of the cases where features are checked, they're like exceptional cases. Like I did a thing and then I encountered this and then I did this and it's slow and I got an error. So now if this feature is enabled, boom, you know, like.
This is why I would like to say that it's a force it to being a compile time error.
Yeah. We use features in about 1 trillion places. It's kind of crazy.
And people are just going to add them, right? And so we can't even anticipate all the places that they're going to get added.
Yeah. Let's see. Right now, 377 feature checks in non-test code in random places.
And that number will only grow.
So I mean, even that's 166 files. So if we required, or if the practice was, if you do an enabled check of a feature in a file, at the top of that file, you should say, like, I use this feature. That's still 166 init blocks. And people will forget to do that. So then the two options are, like, your component registers all the features it uses, and people will get confused about what their component uses because of transitive. Like, I used a helper package, which used a thing, which used a thing. Or you register them in the package where the features are defined. What's an alternative? So what about this? So in most cases, just registering everything is fine. Like there are probably some cases where I know, like, I only use these 5 features and I don't want to pollute the feature space with all 200 features that Cube has defined. What about having a register all method? And we register all from the main package of all of our binaries, and anyone who wants to use features, it's a one-liner to say, like, register all. And if you don't care, then you'll get everything and you'll never hit a panic and it's easy. If you do care, then you can, like, instead of registering all, you can register the particular ones that you want to honor.
Where would register all live?
I would say in the same package that we define the features in. So
Yeah.
Similar to where we define types and we have an add to scheme.
So what about a register public and a register all?
I mean, if they're in the API package, aren't they all public?
Well, so my question is, do we want to make them all public? Does KK have its own sort of things that are only for KK binaries versus things that are more publicly consumable? Because it seems like we have maybe a dozen features right now that we want to make public.
I see. And so not moving all 150 definitions out, only moving the ones that we want to reference from staging repos, from code that lives in staging repos.
That's what I'm thinking, and I mean I like that anyway, because if as soon as we make it staging, we're saying it's part of our public API, and now we have to worry about things like deprecation policies, backward compatibility, deprecation policy, etc. So I think only add that burden to ourselves for the features we actually need to support publicly.
That seems like it's probably okay. Do we think do we anticipate like shortly moving all of the things that Kube API server uses to staging and then moving them to API? Like if we really think it will be a small number, then it seems okay to divide them. If we think it's going to be like a third of them and the next release, another third of them are going to move, and then the next release, the rest of them are going to move, then it's probably not worth the effort. So I don't have a good sense for what we're going to do there.
So I don't know that I do either. I know that big cloud provider, we only currently are aware of 2 features that we want to make public. I guess there's the ones that you were looking at that are in API server, and those are the only ones I'm aware of. I can't say that there aren't others, but
so API server. You said cloud. Is it mostly Cloud Controller Manager?
it's not even Cloud Controller Manager. It's specifically the service controller. Or sorry, it's the Cloud Controller Manager needs to consume the service controller.
Right, but if there were other controllers that lived in Cloud Controller Manager which used feature gates, like you would want
to move
those to be available also. So things referenced from, and that is because we expect people to be sort of building on top of Cloud Controller Manager more than most of the other.
We expect them to have their own builds, like the CCM that's in KK is a reference implementation. It's not meant to be used by, or not necessarily meant to be used by, in fact, we don't even ship it anymore. So it's a reference implementation only in KK. You need to make your own copy for your own cloud provider. And then CSI. CSI is the other one. CSI would be the other one I'm familiar with.
Okay.
Because every cloud provider needs their own CSI module.
Do we reference things from CSI?
I'm not saying we do, but it certainly builds against parts of the staging repo, so in theory it could.
Yeah. I kind of think that falls into the same category as like Client Go and Kube Control, and like that's more of a library, not a process that has CLI options and config files.
No, but what I'm saying is there are CSI. I mean, we KK do not ship them, but cloud providers have to ship CSI sidecars, right?
Yeah. Is that the CSI driver? No.
Well, the CSI driver has to embed in something, right? Yeah. There is some process that is running on the kubelet that's actually doing mount, unmount, attach, and detach.
Yeah. Okay. I just looked up like some of the so like the external provisioner for CSI currently references KSIO Kubernetes. Maybe for this reason, maybe for other reasons, I don't know what it uses. But
Well, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're pulling. I think there's a new like ephemeral storage feature gate. So I wouldn't be surprised if they end up calling that.
yeah. So for things that live outside the Kubernetes repository, like right now, flipping the default for a feature consistently changes the default for every component we ship because we ship them all like in a monolithic release. As soon as you have feature gates published and referenced from things that live outside Kubernetes, then you depend on which version of the library they link against. And
this is all more reason why I think that we shouldn't make anything public that doesn't have to be.
yeah.
Because like at least if it's a short list, if you change that one of those things, you know that you're going to be having issues and you need to probably release note it and do other things, right? I don't want to have to do that with every feature gate.
Yeah. Yeah. I guarantee that someone will pull in the K8s.io API package and be like, oh, well, this feature isn't on. And then talk to an API server that is one version newer where that feature is actually on. And they're going to be like, but it said the feature was not enabled.
I agree, and that's a longer problem, but I mean, to some degree, we have that. We're going to have that even today, right? I mean, as an example, Kubelet is not guaranteed to be at the same version as the Kube API server.
That's true, but the kubelet, like at least we are aware of that. Like when we write the kubelet, like we know what that means. Someone who isn't us writing a client is definitely going to call the enabled function and be confused about what it means.
So it sounds to me like we need to put big warnings on the enable function API, and we should be, and again, I'm just going to keep coming back to, this is just all the more reason why I think we should minimize the number of public features.
Yeah.
Because your points are right.
Okay.
Also, Andrew has a question. Any feature included in a release is public anyway because it's exposed via flags?
The name of the feature is, but the default state of the feature is not programmatically referenceable. So I agree that the name is API. And so there's like 3 levels. Is there a string constant that has the name that you can reference? Like, sure. Like, throw all of those in K8s.io API. I don't care about that. Then there's like, is it alpha, beta, GA, deprecated, enabled by default, locked to the default? That is not exposed today in a programmatically referenceable way. And then the third is like, is it registered into a feature gate? So those are sort of the 3 levels of what we could expose.
One other quick question, sort of, and that on your point 2. There is a silly end run you can do around your point 2, which is to pass about it being programmatic, which is you can pass a string in, and that will, rather than passing in the constant.
That's fine. I mean, like requiring people to reference our programmatic constant drives me crazy. Like someone says, I can't drive this because I don't have a constant available. I was like, it's a constant. Just use a string. Like, that's fine. If the string worked in your testing, it will work in prod.
Except, well, here's my thing. The string makes it so it's no longer a compile time error, right? Now you converted it back to a runtime error.
Yeah.
And so I was actually going to suggest, do we want to think about something like suggesting a linter mechanism to say, please don't pass strings into this method?
I don't feel that strongly about that.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. I will try to summarize some of these back into the relevant PRs. I think there were three things that we talked about. One was the import guards from the places that cannot and don't reference features today that we probably don't want to without further thought. One is not blindly moving all features out to K8s.io API, but just like the ones that we intend to be consumed externally for now. And then the third was an easy way for people to register all of the features we do expose for those who don't care about curating. And then we would call that probably from the main method of all of the components we ship.
Yep.
That seem sane-ish?
Seems sane-ish, yeah.
Okay. All right. Want to go 10 minutes early? Anyone else have anything else they want to talk about? All right. Thank you all. See you on the internet.